Welcome to our channel. Join us on an epic journey through the very soul of a nation. We will explore the DNA of Colombia, a 15-part narrative tracing its history from the first human footprints to its vibrant, modern identity, uncovering stories of gold, conflict, resilience, and creation. The DNA of Colombia, a nation's epic story. Part 1. The first footprints, peopling the Colombian highlands. The world was draped in ice, a great chill clinging to the peaks of the northern Andes, when the first human whispers echoed through the high valleys of what would one day be Colombia. These were not the sounds of conquest or the clang of gold, but the subtle sounds of survival. The snap of a twig under a careful foot, the sharp crack of flaked stone, and the low murmur of a people navigating a landscape both formidable and breathtaking. The high-altitude plains, or savannas, nestled between. The towering cordilleras offered a unique refuge. Here, amid strange, stunted trees and the giant frailgin plants that dotted the paramos like silent sentinels, the story of a nation's DNA began, woven from the threads of endurance, adaptation, and the profound connection between humanity and a wild, untamed earth. The chronicles of this era are not written in ink, but are etched in rock shelters, buried in the sediment of ancient lakes, and held within the genetic memory of the very land itself. The journey into this new continent was one of unimaginable hardship and discovery. Migrating bands of hunter-gatherers, their ancestors having crossed the Bering Strait millennia before, filtered down through the Americas, their movements dictated by the ebb and flow of glaciers and the pursuit of sustenance. Colombia, with its unique position as the gateway to South America, became a crucial corridor and, for many, a final destination. Archaeological evidence from sites like El Abra and Tequendama, just north of the Sabana de Bogota, provides a tantalizing glimpse into this deep past. Radiocarbon dating of stone tools, bone fragments, and ancient campfires pushes the timeline of human occupation back to at least 12,500 years ago, placing these early Colombians among the first inhabitants of the continent. They were pioneers in the truest sense, entering a world populated by creatures of a gargantuan scale. Mastodons, with their shaggy coats and immense tusks, roamed the high plains alongside giant ground sloths and the formidable short-faced bear. The tools left behind, scrapers, choppers, and finely worked spear points, speak of a people who were not merely surviving, but thriving, mastering the art of the hunt in a high-stakes environment where a single mistake could mean the difference between a feast and a tragedy. Their lives were a testament to collective effort and an intimate understanding of their prey and the rhythms of the seasons. As the great ice sheets of the Pleistocene began their slow retreat, the world warmed, and the landscape of the Colombian highlands underwent a profound transformation. The vast herds of megafauna, unable to adapt to the changing climate and vegetation, gradually vanished, leaving a void in the ecosystem and a challenge for its human inhabitants. This climatic shift, far from being a catastrophe, spurred one of the most significant innovations in human history: the slow, deliberate transition from a nomadic hunter-gatherer existence to a more settled, agriculturally based society. The people of the highlands turned their gaze from the disappearing giants to the fertile soil beneath their feet. They began to experiment with the wild plants that flourished in the Andean environment, learning to cultivate varieties of potatoes, beans, and maize. This was not a sudden revolution, but a gradual process of coevolution, a dance of domestication between humans and plants that unfolded over thousands of years. This agricultural awakening anchored communities to specific territories, allowing for the growth of larger, more complex social groups. It was the dawn of the village, the first step towards the intricate societies that would one day rise in these same mountains. The paramos and high Andean forests, once just hunting grounds, became a larder and a laboratory, a place where the foundations of a new way of life were carefully laid, seed by seed. The artistic and spiritual lives of these early peoples flowed directly from their environment. In the rock shelters that protected them from the biting winds and highland rains, they left behind a breathtaking gallery of their world. The pictographs of Chiribiquete, though in the Amazonian lowlands, hint at a shared cosmological understanding that likely extended into the mountains. A universe teeming with jaguar spirits, celestial events, and the rituals of the hunt in the highlands. Themselves, sites like the Sachika Rock Art Mural showcase a vibrant visual language. Figures of men, perhaps shamans or hunters, are depicted alongside the animals that held both practical and symbolic importance: deer, birds, and snakes. These paintings were more than mere decoration. They were likely mnemonic devices, historical records, ceremonial backdrops, or portals to the spirit world. They represent a deep intellectual engagement with the cosmos, an attempt to understand their place within the grand order of nature. The choice of pigments, reds and blacks derived from mineral ochres, and locations of the paintings, often in places of acoustic resonance or striking natural beauty, suggest a sophisticated and intentional spiritual practice, a dialogue with the sacred that was written directly onto the stone canvas of their homeland. Life in the early highland settlements was a delicate balance of labor, community, and ingenuity. The construction of dwellings, likely semi-permanent structures of wood and thatch, required communal effort. The grinding of grain, the weaving of baskets from mountain fibers, and the shaping of pottery were the rhythms of daily life. Early ceramic fragments, though simple in design, mark a significant technological leap, allowing for the storage of surplus food and water, and the ability to cook grains and tubers more effectively, unlocking new sources of nutrition. This, in turn, fueled population growth and allowed for the specialization of labor. Not everyone needed to be a hunter or a farmer. Some could become artisans, priests, or leaders. The social fabric grew more complex, woven from kinship ties, shared rituals, and collective memory of their journey into this land. The challenges were immense: unpredictable weather, the ever-present threat of crop failure, and the diseases that can afflict any growing population. But the bonds of community provided a powerful resilience. This was the forging of a culture of interdependence, a recognition that survival and prosperity were not individual pursuits, but a shared endeavor, a principle that would echo through the ages. The legacy of these first peoples is not one of towering pyramids or golden empires, but something far more fundamental, is the legacy of adaptation, of turning a harsh and alien environment into a home. Is the deep knowledge of the Andean world, of its soils, its plants, its waters, and its spirits. This period, stretching across millennia, represents the long and patient childhood of Colombian civilization, a time of quiet observation and profound discovery. The archaeological record remains frustratingly incomplete, a puzzle with most of its pieces still buried beneath the soil of the savannas and hidden within the folds of the mountains. Yet, what has been unearthed tells a powerful story, one of a hardy and intelligent people who laid the human foundation in the highlands. They were the original pioneers who proved that life could flourish at 2,600 meters above the sea, who painted their beliefs onto the rock, and who first understood the sacred generosity of this mountainous land. Their footprints, though faint, are indelible, marking the beginning of the long and complex journey that is the DNA of Colombia. Part 2. Goldsmiths of the Andes, the Muisca and Tairona. Long after the first hunters had tamed the highlands, new and profoundly complex societies began to blossom across the Colombian landscape. Their sophistication measured not in empires of conquest, but in the intricate systems of their beliefs and the dazzling brilliance of their art. In the cool, high plains of the eastern Cordillera and the steamy, vertical world of the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, two cultures, the Muisca and the Tairona, rose to become masters of their environments and creators of some of the most breathtaking metallurgy the world has ever known. For them, gold was not a currency of commerce, but the very sweat of the sun, a sacred substance that allowed mortals to commune with the gods. It was a vessel for spiritual power, a conduit for cosmic energy, and the ultimate expression of a worldview where the physical and the divine were woven into a single, shimmering fabric. Their workshops, hidden in the mountain mists, were not merely forges, but sanctuaries where metal was transformed into meaning. In the Altiplano Cundiboyacense, the same savannas that had nourished the earliest settlers were now home to the Muisca, the people of salt. Their society was a marvel of political organization, not a centralized empire, but a loose confederation of chiefdoms, dominated by two powerful leaders, the Zipa of Bacata, modern Bogota, and the Zac of Hunza, modern Tunja. The Muisca landscape was one of ordered agriculture, with fields of maize, potatoes, and quinoa blanketing the valleys, a testament to their deep understanding of the Andean ecosystem. Their true wealth, however, lay beneath the earth in vast salt deposits, which they mined with great skill in places like Zipaquira and Nemocon. This salt was their primary trade good, a white gold that they exchanged with neighboring peoples for coca leaves from the lowlands, tropical bird feathers, and most importantly, raw gold. The Muisca were not miners of gold themselves. They were master alchemists and artisans who transformed the raw material acquired through trade into objects of profound spiritual significance. Their society was governed by a complex ritual calendar, and their spiritual life was guided by a priestly class, the Zeeks, who interpreted the will of the gods. The Muisca relationship with gold was one of reverence and offering. Their cosmology was rich with deities like Su, the sun god, and Chia, his wife, the moon goddess. Gold, with its solar luster, was the physical embodiment of Su's creative power. The Muisca artisans perfected the art of tumbaga, an alloy of gold and copper that was easier to cast and had a lower melting point, allowing for the creation of incredibly detailed pieces. Using the lost wax casting technique, they produced thousands of small votive figures known as tunjos. These were not idols to be worshipped but offerings, physical prayers left at sacred sites like lakes, caves, and mountaintops to petition the gods for fertility, health, or protection. The pinnacle of this worldview was the ceremony that gave rise to the legend of El Dorado. At the sacred lake Guatavita, the newly inaugurated Muisca ruler, covered in gold dust, would journey to the center of the lake on a raft laden with gold and emeralds. As his people watched from the shore, he would plunge into the cold, dark water, washing the gold from his body as his attendants cast the precious offerings into the depths, a symbolic act of renewal and cosmic balancing, returning the sacred metal to its origins in the water and the earth. While the Muisca reigned on the high plains, a different civilization flourished in the Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, a massive, pyramid-shaped mountain that rises abruptly from a Caribbean coast to snow-capped peaks. Here, in a world of staggering verticality and astonishing biodiversity, the Tairona forged a society defined by extraordinary engineering and a fierce spirit of independence. They were master builders who literally carved their civilization into the mountainsides to live and farm in this challenging terrain. They constructed a vast network of stone-paved paths, retaining walls, canals, and agricultural terraces that snaked across the steep slopes, preventing erosion and creating arable land. At the heart of this network were sophisticated urban centers, true cities of stone, with circular plazas, ceremonial centers, and stone foundations for hundreds of houses. The most famous of these, Ciudad Perdida, or the Lost City, rediscovered in the 1970s, is a breathtaking testament to their ingenuity and social organization, a city seamlessly integrated with its jungle environment, connected by a network of more than 1,000 stone steps ascending the mountain. The Tairona were also goldsmiths of unparalleled skill, but their artistry possessed a different spirit from that of the Muisca. Their gold work is often more complex, more powerful, and more zoomorphic, reflecting the potent and sometimes intimidating spiritual world of the jungle and the mountains. They created spectacular pendants, nose rings, and pectorals depicting figures that blend human and animal characteristics. Batmen with great wings, jaguar shamans, and chieftains adorned in impossibly intricate regalia. These were not just ornaments, they were symbols of power and transformation, tools for the shamanic journey into the spirit world. The bat, which navigates in darkness and lives in caves, was a powerful symbol of the underworld and the spiritual realm. The Tairona chiefs and shamans who wore these objects were not merely displaying wealth. They were embodying the very powers of the cosmos, becoming conduits for the spirits of the jaguar, the serpent, and the eagle. Their art was a reflection of their cosmology, a worldview centered on the Sierra Nevada itself, which they considered to be the Cora, the heart of the world. The legacy of the Muisca and the Tairona is a brilliant counterpoint to the idea of a monolithic pre-Hispanic America. They were not one people, but a mosaic of sophisticated chiefdoms, each with a unique adaptation to its environment and a distinct artistic and spiritual signature. The Muisca created a world of ritual, confederation, and agricultural order on the high plains, their gold a humble offering to the vastness of the sky and the stillness of the sacred lakes. The Tairona, in contrast, tamed a vertical world with stone and fire, their gold a potent expression of shamanic power and dominion over the spiritual forces of the jungle. Together, they represent a pinnacle of artistic and social development in the Americas before the arrival of Europeans. Their golden artifacts, now housed in museums, are more than just beautiful objects. They are the surviving texts of a lost world, whispering of sacred lakes, stone cities, and a profound understanding of the universe. That saw gold not as a treasure to be hoarded, but as a prayer to be given away. This worldview, so rich and so alien to what was coming, would soon be confronted by an insatiable hunger for the very metal they held so sacred. Part 3. Echoes of the Sea, the Caribbean Gateway. While civilizations of gold and stone commanded the Andean heights, a different world pulsed with life along the sun-scorched northern coast, a world defined not by mountains, but by the endless, restless breathing of the Caribbean Sea. Here, the air was thick with humidity, the scent of salt, and the drone of insects, a stark contrast to the thin, cool atmosphere of the highlands. Life moved to a different rhythm, dictated by the tides, the trade winds, and the seasonal migrations of fish. This long, curving coastline, with its deep bays, mangrove swamps, and the powerful mouth of the Magdalena River, was not a barrier but a gateway, a vast, liquid highway that connected the peoples of the coast to each other, to the islands shimmering on the horizon, and ultimately, to a fate that would arrive on the wings of strange, white-sailed canoes. The DNA of this region was forged in the crucible of sun and water, a blend of maritime skill, fierce independence, and a cosmopolitanism, born of canoe-borne trade. The peoples who inhabited this Caribbean littoral, often grouped under the broad and sometimes inaccurate Spanish term Carib, were masters of their aquatic environment. They were not a monolithic nation, but a mosaic of distinct groups, each adapted to a specific niche of the coastal ecosystem. Some lived in villages nestled in the sheltered bays, their lives revolving around the bounty of the sea. They were expert fishers, using nets, spears, and hooks to harvest the rich marine life, and skilled navigators who ventured far from shore in massive canoes hollowed from the trunks of giant trees. Others settled along the fertile banks of the great rivers, practicing a form of agriculture suited to the tropical heat, cultivating yucca, sweet potatoes, and maize. Their societies were often more fluid and less hierarchical than the great chiefdoms of the interior. Leadership was earned through prowess in warfare, skill in navigation, or shamanic power, not necessarily inherited. They were known for their martial spirit, a fierce resistance to outsiders that would be sorely tested in the years to come. Their bodies were often adorned with intricate painted designs, and they were skilled in pottery and the weaving of cotton, creating hammocks that were perfectly adapted to the hot, humid climate. The Caribbean coast was a vibrant hub of exchange, a dynamic zone where cultures and goods flowed freely. The sea and the rivers were the arteries of this trade. Coastal communities exchanged dried fish, sea salt, and prized seashells with peoples further inland, receiving in return the gold work of the Tirona, emeralds from the Muisca territories, and coca leaves from the lower mountain slopes. This was not a silent, faceless barter, but a complex social and political process, creating alliances, rivalries, and a shared material culture that stretched for hundreds of kilometers. The Magdalena River, in particular, was the great artery connecting the coast to the heart of the continent, a conduit for goods, ideas, and people moving between the tropical lowlands and the Andean highlands. The coastal peoples were the gatekeepers of this exchange, the middlemen who understood the languages and customs of both the sea and the interior. This constant interaction fostered a resilient and adaptable culture, one accustomed to encountering the other and negotiating its place in a diverse and interconnected world. This world of ancient rhythms and established exchanges was shattered at the dawn of the 16th century. The first echoes of the coming storm were likely rumors. Strange tales passed along trade routes from the islands to the north, stories of pale, bearded men who commanded thunder and sailed in houses that moved across the water. Then, in 1501, the rumors took physical form when the ships of Rodrigo de Bastidas charted the coastline from the Guajira Peninsula to the Gulf of Uraba. This was the first documented European contact, a moment of profound and mutual astonishment. For the indigenous peoples, these were beings from a world beyond imagining. Their ships, their metal armor, their horses and war dogs, and their firearms belonged to no known category of their cosmos. For the Spanish, this was a new land, a tierra firme they believed to be filled with unimaginable riches, particularly the gold ornaments they saw adorning the natives. This initial contact was driven by a mixture of curiosity and commerce, but it quickly curdled into something far more sinister. The Spanish hunger for gold was insatiable, and their desire for slave labor to work the mines and plantations of the newly conquered Caribbean islands was equally rapacious. The opening of a gateway was not a gentle process. It was a violent and brutal invasion. The Spanish crown, seeking to control this new territory and its perceived wealth, authorized the founding of permanent settlements. In 1525, Rodrigo de Bastidas returned, not as an explorer, but as a conqueror, founding the city of Santa Marta near the foothills of the Tirona-controlled Sierra Nevada. In 1533, Pedro de Heredia established Cartagena on a magnificent deep-water bay. These were not cities in the native sense. They were fortified outposts, military and commercial beachheads designed to project Spanish power into the interior. From these coastal enclaves, expeditions or entradas were launched, brutal campaigns of plunder, enslavement, and extermination. The coastal peoples, with their traditions of fierce independence, fought back with tenacity and courage. but they were ultimately no match for the technological and biological weapons of the invaders. Steel swords, shattered wooden clubs, crossbows, and arquebus outranged bows and arrows, and cavalry charges could break any infantry formation. Even more devastating were the invisible invaders. Smallpox, measles, and influenza, diseases to which the native populations had no immunity, which swept through villages like wildfire, killing far more than any sword or musket. The Caribbean Gateway, once a symbol of connection and indigenous autonomy, was irrevocably transformed. It became the primary entry point for the Spanish conquest, the place where the old world and the new collided with cataclysmic force. The sea that had once brought canoes bearing fish and salt now brought galleons laden with soldiers, priests, and colonists. The shoreline that had hosted vibrant trading villages now became the site of slave markets and shipyards. The very DNA of the coast was being rewritten. The indigenous populations were decimated, their societies shattered, their survivors driven into remote swamps and forests or absorbed into the new colonial order. But their legacy was not erased. It survived in the names of places, in the local knowledge of plants and animals, in the food and language, and in the resilient mestizo culture that would emerge from the ashes of this brutal encounter. The echoes of the sea now carried a new, complex sound. A chorus of indigenous memory, Spanish ambition, and the faint, tragic whispers of the African slaves who would soon be brought through this same gateway to work the lands of a conquered world. Part 4. The Spanish Anvil, Forging a New Kingdom. With the Caribbean coast now a Spanish foothold, a new fever gripped the conquistadors. The rumors that had trickled down the riverways and mountain paths, tales of a golden king and a city paved with the sun's metal, coalesced into the singular, obsessive myth of El Dorado. This legend became a siren song, pulling men away from the relative safety of the coastal forts and into the vast, unknown heart of the continent. They sought a kingdom of gold, but what they would create was something entirely different. A kingdom forged of steel, faith, and blood, hammered into shape on the great anvil of the Andes. The new kingdom of Granada was not discovered. It was violently made, its foundations laid by men driven to the very limits of human endurance by a potent cocktail of greed, ambition, and a fanatical belief in their own destiny. The primary instrument of this forging was Gonzalo Jimenez de Quesada, a lawyer-turned-commander who in 1536 led a force of some 800 men away from the stifling heat of Santa Marta and into the green labyrinth of the Magdalena River Valley. This was no glorious march, but a 9-month descent into hell. The jungle was a living entity that sought to consume them. Men drowned in the thick river mud were picked off by silent arrows from unseen tribes and were stalked by jaguars. And immense crocodiles, more terrifying than any visible enemy, were the fevers that racked their bodies and the starvation that hollowed their faces, forcing them to eat their horses, their leather straps, and anything else that could be chewed. The river, their intended highway, became a relentless adversary, its currents and swamps claiming men and supplies daily. By the time they finally began their ascent into the cooler air of the eastern Cordillera, only a fraction of Quesada's original force, fewer than 200 men, remained a skeletal, fever-ridden army of ghosts clad in rusted armor. As these ragged survivors climbed into the highlands, they emerged from the jungle nightmare into a world of shocking order and abundance, the land of the Muisca. They saw cultivated fields, orderly villages, and a population that was well-fed and sophisticated. For the Muisca, the arrival of these starved, bearded men must have seemed like a terrifying apparition. Quesada, using a mixture of brute force and cunning diplomacy, quickly exploited the political divisions between the Zipa of Bacada and the Zac of Hunza. The Spaniards' steel weapons, crossbows, and above all, their horses, creatures the Muisca had never seen, and which seemed to merge man and beast into one terrifying warrior, gave them an overwhelming military advantage. They marched through the Muisca Confederation, capturing the major settlements, torturing chiefs for the location of hidden gold, and desecrating temples. The Zipa, Tisquasusa, was killed in a skirmish, and his successor, Sajipa, was publicly executed by the Spanish after failing to produce a room full of gold. The Zac Quemiancatoca was similarly captured and humiliated. The Spanish found gold, but not the solid cities of their dreams. Instead, they found thousands of small, exquisite tunjos and other votive pieces, which they promptly melted down into crude ingots, destroying a priceless artistic and spiritual heritage in their frantic quest for bullion. Just as Quesada was consolidating his brutal victory, a moment of almost unbelievable historical coincidence unfolded on the high Sabana de Bogota. From the south, another expedition appeared, led by Sebastián de Belalcázar, a hardened veteran of the conquest of Peru. Belalcázar had marched north from Quito, also chasing his own version of the El Dorado myth. His force was well-equipped, experienced, and had no intention of yielding to the newcomer Quesada. Then, as if summoned by some strange historical magnetism, a third party arrived from the east. Nikolaus Federmann, a German conquistador in the service of the Welser-banking family of Augsburg, who had marched his own long-suffering army across the vast, inhospitable plains of the Llanos and over the freezing Paramos. Three armies, having begun their journeys hundreds of miles apart in complete ignorance of one another, now stood face to face on the same Andean plain, each claiming the prize. For a tense period, the threat of a full-scale battle between the rival European forces loomed, a conflict that would have undoubtedly been fought over the ruins of the civilization they had all come to conquer. In a remarkable display of legalistic pragmatism over military bravado, the three commanders managed to avert bloodshed. They parleyed, argued, and ultimately agreed that the claim to this new territory could not be settled by their swords on the Sabana. Instead, they would all travel back to Spain and present their cases directly to the king and the Council of the Indies. Before departing on August 6, 1538, Quesada formally established the city of Santa Fe de Bogota near the former Muisca capital of Bocata, consecrating a chapel of 12 humble, thatch-roofed huts in honor of the 12 apostles. It was a modest beginning for what would become the administrative and political heart of the new realm. The three rivals left for the coast together, an uneasy truce holding them in check, leaving their lieutenants in command of their weary troops. This singular event was crucial. It affirmed the ultimate authority of the Spanish crown over the ambitions of individual conquistadors, establishing the principle that this new land belonged not to the men who conquered it, but to the distant king they served. The departure of the three commanders did not end the process of forging. It only began the next stage. With the military conquest of the Muisca heartland complete, the Spanish began the methodical process of imposing a new political, economic, and social order. The new Kingdom of Granada was officially established, governed by a royal court, the Real Audiencia, which answered to the viceroyalty of Peru. The true anvil of this new kingdom was the encomienda system. Individual conquistadors and colonists were granted rights to the labor and tribute of specific indigenous communities. In theory, the encomenderos were supposed to protect their indigenous charges and instruct them in the Catholic faith. In practice, it was a brutal system of legalized servitude, forcing the Muisca and other groups to labor in fields and mines for the profit of their new Spanish masters. The old social structures were shattered, the indigenous economy was reoriented to serve Spanish interests, and the land itself was reapportioned into vast estates. The search for El Dorado had ended, but the extraction of the real wealth of the new kingdom, the labor of its people and the fruits of its soil, had just begun. Part 5. Crucible of Faith, Religion in the Colony. The conquest of the new Kingdom of Granada was fought with steel, but was cemented with the cross. Hand in hand with the soldier marched the friar, and where the conquistador saw a land to be plundered, the missionary saw a harvest of souls to be won for God. The spiritual conquest was no less profound and no less violent than the military one. It was a systematic campaign to dismantle an entire cosmology and erect a new one in its place. This was the great crucible of faith, a period of immense spiritual upheaval where the ancient beliefs of the Andes and the Caribbean were plunged into the purifying fire of Spanish Catholicism. The goal was absolute conversion, the complete erasure of the old gods, but the outcome was something far more complex and enduring. A syncretic faith, a uniquely Colombian spiritual architecture built upon the foundations of a demolished world. Its spires reaching for a Christian heaven, but its roots still entwined with the sacred earth, lakes, and mountains of the ancestors. The first act of this spiritual drama was the extirpation of idolatries, a holy war against the indigenous spiritual world. Priests and friars, particularly from the Franciscan and Dominican orders, saw the Muisca and Tairona religions not as legitimate belief systems, but as the work of the devil. The sacred lakes, like Guatavita, were seen as demonic portals. The Tunjos were misshapen idols. The Zeeks and Mamos, indigenous priests, were satanic agents. With righteous fervor, they smashed religious objects, burned sacred textiles, and razed temples to the ground. In a powerful act of symbolic dominance, churches were deliberately constructed on the very sites of the most important indigenous shrines, so that the new faith would physically and spiritually supplant the old. The Great Sun Temple at Sogamoso, a center of Muisca worship, was burned, and on its ashes rose a Catholic church. This was a campaign to create a cosmic void, to convince the native population that their gods were either false or had abandoned them, leaving them no choice but to turn to the one true God of the victors. Having torn down the old faith, the church began the immense task of building the new. This was not done solely through sermons and threats of damnation, but through a masterful use of pedagogy, art, and ritual. For a population that was largely illiterate, visual and experiential learning was paramount. Churches were filled with dramatic, often bloody, statues of Christ's Passion and serene figures of the Virgin Mary, their gilded robes shimmering in the candlelight. Religious plays depicting biblical stories were staged in town plazas, their spectacle and drama captivating audiences and imparting the core tenets of the faith. The Catholic liturgical calendar, with its cycle of feasts and fasts, was superimposed onto the old agricultural and ceremonial rhythms. The procession of a patron saint replaced the rituals for a mountain deity. The Feast of Corpus Christi absorbed older harvest festivals. The sacrament of confession became a powerful tool for surveillance and control, allowing the priest insight into the innermost lives and lingering superstitions of his flock. Through these methods, Catholicism was woven into the very fabric of daily life, its bells marking the hours of the day, its saints presiding over every village. Yet the indigenous soul was not a blank slate, and conversion was never a simple act of replacement. Instead, a subtle and powerful process of syncretism began, a blending of worlds that the priests could not entirely control. While publicly professing Catholicism, many communities continued their old rituals in secret. They might pray to the Virgin Mary, but see in her the face of Bashu, the Muisca mother goddess who emerged from a lake. A powerful mountain spirit might be given the name of a Catholic saint to make its veneration permissible. Small offerings of coca leaves or maize might be left at a wayside cross, a gesture unintelligible to the Spanish priest, but perfectly understood by the supplicant as a continuation of ancient practice. This was not hypocrisy, but a profound act of cultural resilience. It was a way to make the new, imposed faith their own, to find echoes of their lost cosmology within the Christian narrative, and to ensure that the ancestors were not entirely forgotten. This folk Catholicism, rich with local traditions and pre-Hispanic resonances, became the true religion of the countryside, a faith that was practiced and felt far from the watchful eyes of the bishops in Bogota. The church in the New Kingdom of Granada quickly grew from a missionary enterprise into the most powerful institution in the colony, rivaling even the colonial government. Through tithes, bequests, and land grants, religious orders like the Jesuits, Dominicans, and Augustinians amassed enormous wealth and became the largest landowners in the realm. They controlled education, founding the first universities, such as the Colegio Mayor de Nuestra Señora del Rosario and the Pontificia Universidad Javeriana, institutions dedicated to training the sons of the Spanish elite in theology, law, and the arts. They were the colony's primary record keepers, their parish priests meticulously recording every birth, marriage, and death, creating an invaluable, if biased, chronicle of colonial life. This immense power, both temporal and spiritual, created a new elite and a new hierarchy. But it also fostered deep-seated tensions, conflicts between different religious orders, and between the church and the civil authorities over land, labor, and jurisdiction were a constant feature of the colonial landscape. In 1610, the shadow of the Holy Office of the Inquisition fell across the colony with the establishment of its tribunal in the port city of Cartagena. While its primary targets were not the indigenous peoples, who were considered neophytes, too new in their faith to be held fully accountable for heresy, its presence created a pervasive climate of fear and enforced a rigid orthodoxy. The Inquisition investigated cases of blasphemy, witchcraft, and heresy, primarily among the Spanish, Mestizo, and African populations. It was particularly vigilant against crypto-Jews, Jews who secretly practiced their faith while publicly professing Catholicism, and Protestants who might arrive on foreign ships. While the number of executions was relatively small compared to tribunals in Spain, the auto de fe, the public ceremony where the condemned were shamed and punished, was a terrifying spectacle of the Church's ultimate power. The Inquisition stood as the final guardian of the crucible, ensuring that the faith being forged within it did not deviate from the strict doctrines dictated from Madrid, a constant reminder that in the new kingdom, the soul was as much a territory to be controlled as the land itself. Part 6. The Cry of the Comuneros, Seeds of Discontent. For over 2 centuries, the new Kingdom of Granada had settled into a rigid, hierarchical order, a society governed by a distant king, a powerful church, and a local elite of Spanish birth. Life was hard and the social strata were firmly set, but the system possessed a certain stability born of tradition and isolation. This fragile equilibrium was shattered in the late 18th century, not by an invading army, but by a series of decrees from a modernizing, centralizing Spanish monarchy. Under the Bourbon dynasty, Spain sought to rationalize its vast American empire to make it more efficient, more controllable, and above all, more profitable. To achieve this, the crown dispatched bureaucrats armed with new regulations, men like the Visitador Regent Juan Francisco Gutierrez de Piners, who arrived in Santa Fe with a mandate to squeeze every possible peso out of the colonial economy to fund Spain's European wars. He imposed a battery of new taxes, raised the prices of existing ones like the alcabala, sales tax, and enforced hated state monopolies on essential goods like tobacco and aguardiente, a local spirit. These reforms were an assault not on an abstract idea of liberty, but on the very livelihoods of the common people, igniting a slow-burning fuse of resentment that would soon snake its way through the towns and fields of the Andes. The explosion came on March 16, 1781, in the bustling market town of Socorro, a center for tobacco cultivation and textile artisanship. This was not the world of the grand Bogotá elite, but of small landholders, merchants, and laborers, a proud, hard-working mestizo population. On that fateful day, an official tacked up a new edict detailing the latest tax hikes. As a crowd gathered, murmuring in anger, a woman of the people, a shopkeeper named Manuela Beltran, pushed her way to the front. In an act of electrifying defiance, she ripped the decree from the wall, shouting the words that would become the rallying cry of a revolution. Viva el Rey, muera el mal gobierno. Long live the king, down with the bad government. This was a crucial distinction. Beltran and the furious crowd that instantly erupted into a riot were not, at this stage, seeking to sever ties with Spain. They were loyal subjects protesting what they saw as the abusive and illegitimate actions of the king's corrupt local officials. They were appealing to a perceived, long-standing pact between the monarch and his people, a pact that men like Gutierrez de Piners had violated. The riot in Socorro was the spark, a spontaneous eruption of popular fury that tore through the region with astonishing speed. What began as a market riot rapidly transformed into an organized insurrection. From Socorro, San Gil, and other towns in the Santander region, the call to arms went out. Captains were elected, and a vast, unruly, but impassioned army began to form. The Ejército del Común, the army of the common people. This was a force unlike any seen before in the New Kingdom. Its ranks swelled with thousands of peasants, artisans, and small farmers, armed with machetes, homemade pikes, and old hunting muskets. Crucially, this coalition transcended the rigid colonial caste system. Mestizos and poor whites marched alongside indigenous groups who sought the restoration of their communal lands and the abolition of tribute. Even a number of Creoles, American-born Spaniards, joined the cause, resentful of the privileges granted to the peninsulars, those born in Spain. To give this popular movement a veneer of respectability and leadership, the rebels chose Juan Francisco Burbio, a Creole landowner of some local influence, as their general. With a force that eventually grew to nearly 20,000 souls, this formidable peasant army began a slow, deliberate march on the capital, Santa Fe de Bogotá, to lay their grievances at the feet of the vice-regal government. The news of the approaching army sent waves of panic through the elite of Santa Fe. The viceroy, Manuel Antonio Flores, was in Cartagena, and the capital was virtually undefended. The members of the Real Audiencia, the highest royal court, watched in terror as the largest military force in the colony's history advanced on their city, a force born not of royal decree, but of popular rage. In this moment of crisis, with civil authority crumbling, power devolved to the one figure who commanded universal, if wary, respect, the Archbishop of Bogotá, Antonio Caballero y Góngora. A shrewd political operator, as well as a prince of the church, the Archbishop understood that to meet the Comuneros with the paltry forces at his disposal would be suicide. He saw that the only weapon that could stop the march of 20,000 angry men was not a cannon, but a promise. He offered to negotiate, positioning himself as a neutral arbiter, a man of God who could mediate between the Crown's officials, and its aggrieved subjects. The meeting took place in the town of Zipaquirá, a day's march north of the now terrified capital. There, the Comunero leaders, full of hope and revolutionary fervor, presented their demands to the Archbishop and the Government Commission. Their document, the Capitulations de Zipaquirá, was a revolutionary manifesto. It consisted of 35 articles demanding far more than just the repeal of recent taxes. It called for the abolition of the hated monopolies, the restoration of indigenous land rights, an end to the tribute payments, and most significantly, a demand for preferential treatment for American-born Creoles in appointments to high government office. It was a sweeping vision for a reformed, more just, and more autonomous new kingdom. The Archbishop, with solemn ceremony, accepted every single demand. He swore a sacred oath on the Gospels, and a mass was held to celebrate the agreement, believing they had achieved a historic victory, that their cries had been heard and their pact with the king restored. The jubilant Comunero army disbanded, its members melting back into the mountains and valleys from which they came. The celebration was tragically short-lived. It had all been a masterful deception. Once the Comunero army was safely scattered, the news arrived from Cartagena. Viceroy Flores, citing the fact that the agreement had been signed under duress and without his authority, declared the capitulations of Zipaquirá completely null and void. The betrayal was absolute. Fresh troops, loyal to the crown, marched up from the coast to enforce the old order. A small, more radical faction of the Comuneros, under the command of a fiery leader named José Antonio Galán, refused to surrender, attempting to restart the rebellion. But without the massed army, his cause was hopeless. He was soon captured, and the crown's vengeance was swift and terrible. Galán and 3 other leaders were executed in Bogotá. Their bodies were dismembered, and their heads, hands, and feet were sent to be displayed on pikes in main plazas of Socorro and the other rebel towns, a gruesome and unambiguous message to any who might dare to challenge royal authority again. The revolt of the Comuneros was brutally crushed, but the seeds of discontent had been watered with the blood of martyrs. The memory of the march, the hope of the capitulations, and the bitterness of the betrayal would linger in the collective consciousness, a powerful lesson that reform could not be begged from the bad government, but would one day have to be taken by force. Part 7. Bolívar's Dream, the Quest for Gran Colombia. The ghost of José Antonio Galán, dismembered and displayed as a warning, cast a long, chilling shadow over the new kingdom. For nearly 3 decades after the Comunero revolt, the Spanish boot pressed firmly on the neck of the colony, enforcing a tense and bitter peace. But beneath the surface of enforced loyalty, the seeds of discontent had found fertile ground in the minds of a new generation of American-born elites, the Creoles. These men, educated in the universities the church had founded, were not moved by tax burdens alone. They were stirred by dangerous new ideas that slipped past the Inquisition's censors on smuggled pages from revolutionary France and the newly independent United States. Men like Antonio Nariño, who dared to translate and print the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, paid for their audacity with years in prison. But they had lit an intellectual fire that could not be extinguished. The cry for no bad government was slowly, secretly, transforming into a more radical whisper: no king at all. The spark that ignited this tinderbox came not from within, but from a cataclysm in Europe. In 1808, Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Spain, deposed King Ferdinand VII, and placed his own brother, Joseph, on the Spanish throne. This single act shattered the central pillar of the colonial world, royal authority. For 300 years, the colony's loyalty had been to a legitimate Spanish monarch. Now, there was a French usurper on the throne. A crisis of legitimacy swept across the Americas, presenting the Creole elites with a golden opportunity. On July 20, 1810, in Santa Fe de Bogotá, a group of patriot conspirators executed a masterful piece of political theater. They engineered a public dispute with a Spanish merchant, José González Llorente, over the borrowing of a flower vase to adorn a banquet for a visiting royal official. Llorente's angry refusal was the calculated insult they needed. The conspirators fanned the flames of the crowd's anger, turning a minor spat into a massive popular protest against Spanish arrogance. By nightfall, a terrified viceroy was forced to concede to the formation of a local governing council, or junta, which, while still swearing fealty to the distant, deposed King Ferdinand, was the first concrete step towards self-rule. This initial burst of patriotic unity, however, quickly disintegrated into a ruinous period of internal conflict that would cripple the independence movement from its birth. Known to Colombian history as the Patria Boba or Foolish Fatherland, this era saw the newly freed provinces turn on each other with a venom they had previously reserved for the Spanish. Two rival ideologies emerged. From Bogotá, the brilliant but imperious Antonio Nariño championed centralism, arguing that only a strong, unified government could hope to survive the inevitable Spanish counterattack. From the other provinces, led by the intellectual Camilo Torres, came the call for federalism, a system that would grant each region maximum autonomy. The disagreement was not merely philosophical. It was a power struggle between Bogotá and the regional elites. This debate was not settled with words but with cannons, as centralist and federalist armies fought each other across the high plains, wasting precious blood and resources while the true enemy, Spain, regrouped. The Foolish Fatherland was a harsh lesson in the deep-seated regionalism that defined the new kingdom's political DNA, a tendency towards fragmentation that would haunt the nation for centuries. The folly of this internal warfare was exposed in 1815. With Napoleon defeated, King Ferdinand VII was restored to the Spanish throne. He was not a grateful monarch. Viewing the colonial juntas as treason, he dispatched a massive expeditionary army led by General Pablo Murillo, a hardened veteran of the Napoleonic Wars. This was the Reconquista, and Murillo was its merciless instrument. He laid siege to the defiant port of Cartagena, which held out heroically for 105 days before starvation and disease forced its surrender. Murillo then advanced into the interior, his campaign becoming a reign of terror. He systematically hunted down and executed anyone associated with the independence movement. Leaders, soldiers, intellectuals, and even women like Policarpa Salvarrieta, who served as a spy for the rebels, faced the firing squad. The gallows became a common sight in the plazas where the juntas had once been declared. The dream of independence, which had begun with such fervor in 1810, was drowned in a sea of blood. The Patria Boba was over, and a deathly Spanish peace was restored. But from the ashes of this defeat, a new and indomitable figure emerged, Simón Bolívar. Having participated in Venezuela's own failed independence struggles, Bolívar had been driven into exile, but he returned with a hardened resolve and a grand, continental vision. He understood that the revolution could not be won by the urban Creole elites alone. He turned his gaze to the vast, lawless plains of the Llanos, which straddled the border of Venezuela and the new kingdom. Here he forged an army from most unlikely of materials, the Llaneros, the semi-nomadic, mixed-race cowboys of the plains, under the command of brilliant, ruthless sub-commanders like the Venezuelan José Antonio Páez and the new Granadan Francisco de Paula Santander. These horsemen, armed with little more than lances and ferocious courage, became the heart of the patriot army. In the punishing heat and seasonal floods of the Llanos, Bolívar rebuilt the Republican cause, creating a disciplined, resilient fighting force loyal not to province, but to him and the singular idea of liberation. In 1819, with his Llanero army forged and ready, Bolívar conceived and executed one of the most audacious military campaigns in history. Instead of attacking the Spanish head-on, he decided to strike where they least expected it. He would lead his army of over 2,000 men from the sweltering plains of Venezuela, across flooded rivers, and then directly up and over the glacial peaks of the eastern Cordillera to surprise the main royalist army guarding Bogotá, the crossing of the Andes via the desolate Pispaparamo was an epic of human suffering. Men accustomed to tropical heat were exposed to freezing rain and sub-zero temperatures with inadequate clothing. They climbed to altitudes of 4,000 meters, their lungs screaming for air, their feet wrapped in rags. Hundreds died from exposure and exhaustion, and the army's entire cavalry, its horses unable to survive the cold, was lost. It was a skeletal, half-dead army that finally stumbled down into the highlands of Boyaca. The Spanish, under the command of Colonel José María Barrero, were stunned. They could not believe that an enemy force could have emerged from impassable Pispaparamo. Scrambling to defend the capital, Barrero moved his army to block the road to Bogotá. On August 7, 1819, at a small bridge over the Boyaca River, Bolívar's desperate gamble met its final test. The Battle of Boyaca was short and decisive. Santander's vanguard seized the bridge, while Bolívar's main force shattered. The Royalist army, the Spanish defeat was total. Their commander and over 1,600 soldiers were captured. Strategically, it was the death blow to Spanish rule in New Granada. The road to the capital was now undefended. 3 days later, Bolívar marched into Bogotá, not as a rebel, but as the liberator. His impossible dream had been realized, and with the heart of the new kingdom now free, he turned his sights to an even grander vision, the creation of a vast, unified republic, a nation. Called Gran Colombia, that would stretch from the Orinoco to the Pacific. The quest was not over. A new, even more difficult chapter of building a nation from the ruins of a war was about to begin. Part 8. The Thousand Days War, a Nation Divided. Bolivar's grand dream of a unified republic proved to be a magnificent but fragile vessel, breaking apart within a decade of its creation. The same seismic fault lines of regionalism and ideology that had produced the Patria Boba ran directly beneath the foundations of Gran Colombia, and by 1831, the Union had shattered into the separate nations of Venezuela, Ecuador, and New Granada, which would later be renamed Colombia. The departure of a liberator did not solve the fundamental question of how to govern. It merely uncorked the genie of political factionalism. Over the course of the 19th century, the old centralist-federalist debate hardened into two formal political parties that would dominate and bleed the nation for generations. On one side stood the conservatives, champions of a strong central government, protectors of the Catholic Church's traditional role in society and education, and defenders of a hierarchical social order. Opposing them were the liberals, who advocated for federalism, regional autonomy, the separation of church and state, universal education, and free market principles. These were not mere political platforms. They became tribal identities, inherited loyalties for which men were willing to kill and die. The 19th century became a violent laboratory for these competing visions, a seemingly endless cycle of civil wars punctuated by brief, exhausted periods of peace. Power swung like a pendulum. When the liberals were in control, they would write federalist constitutions, strip the church of its lands and privileges, and promote radical reforms. When the conservatives seized power, they would repeal the liberal laws, write centralist constitutions, and restore the church to its former glory. This political instability crippled the nation's economic development and entrenched a culture of armed militancy. By the 1880s, after decades of particularly radical liberal rule, the pendulum swung back with decisive force under the leadership of Rafael Núñez, a former liberal who had become disillusioned with federalist chaos. He spearheaded a movement called the Regeneration. The Regeneration, a sweeping project to end the cycle of war by creating an unassailably strong central state. The fruit of this project was the Constitution of 1886, which abolished the federal United States of Colombia and created the highly centralized Republic of Colombia. It made Catholicism the state religion, placed education back in the hands of the church, and dramatically curtailed civil liberties and press freedoms. For the conservatives, it was the dawn of order and national unity. For the liberals, it was the death of freedom. For more than a decade, the liberals were systematically shut out of power, their voices silenced, their political participation rendered meaningless. The simmering resentment finally reached its boiling point in 1899. The Conservative Party itself had split into two factions, the Nationalists, who were more moderate, and the Historicals, who were intransigent hardliners. The presidential election of 1898 saw the victory of the aging Manuel Antonio San Clemente, a historical propped up by the party's most reactionary elements. For the war hawks within the Liberal Party, this was the final provocation, proof that the government would never allow for peaceful political change. Believing that their only remaining recourse was the bullet, not the ballot, the Liberals launched a poorly coordinated but passionate insurrection in October 1899. They expected a short, decisive war that would topple the government and restore their rights. Instead, they plunged the nation into the longest and most destructive civil war in its history, the Thousand Days War. The conflict that ensued was one of savage, unprecedented brutality, a war that quickly devolved from a clash of formal armies into a sprawling, nationwide guerrilla conflict. The initial battles were fought by organized forces. At the Battle of Prolanzo, the liberals, under the charismatic General Rafael Uribe, won a shocking victory that opened a road to Bogota and gave their cause a surge of hope. But this hope was shattered a few months later at the Battle of Palo Negro, a horrific, 2-week-long meat grinder of trench warfare that resulted in catastrophic losses for both sides and effectively broke the back of the main liberal army. From that point on, the war became a desperate struggle of irregular forces. Liberal guerrillas, armed with machetes and outdated rifles, fought conservative army patrols and paramilitary groups in the mountains and jungles. It was a war of ambushes, summary executions, and scorched earth tactics that devastated the countryside. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, their farms destroyed, their livestock stolen. their sons conscripted into armies they may not have supported. The national economy collapsed, paper money became worthless, and starvation loomed. After nearly 3 years of unrelenting bloodshed, the nation was on its knees, utterly exhausted. The war had no clear victor, only losers. The liberal guerrillas could not win, but the conservative government could not entirely eradicate them. It was a bloody stalemate. Peace negotiations finally began, culminating in 2 separate treaties signed in late 1902. The Treaty of Neerlandia was signed on a banana plantation, where General Uribe surrendered the main liberal forces. The definitive peace was signed aboard the American battleship USS Wisconsin in the Bay of Panama, a stark symbol of the rising influence of the United States in the region. The war was over, leaving a death toll estimated at over 100,000, a shattered economy, and a legacy of bitterness that would poison the nation's political life for decades to come. The final, tragic cost of this internal division was yet to be paid. While Colombia had been consumed by its suicidal civil war, the United States had solidified its plans to build a canal across the Isthmus of Panama. The Colombian government in Bogotá, weakened, bankrupt, and politically chaotic after the war, attempted to negotiate a treaty. But when the Colombian Senate hesitated, seeking better terms, the United States government under President Theodore Roosevelt lost patience. In November 1903, with the implicit support and naval blockade of the U.S., a group of Panamanian separatists declared independence. The Colombian government, its military in shambles and its treasury empty, was powerless to stop it. The 1,000 Days War had not only killed a generation and wrecked the country, its legacy of division and chaos had directly led to the dismemberment of the nation itself, carving the ultimate price of political intolerance into the very map of the Republic. Part 9. Coffee and Modernity, the Dawn of a New Economy. In the desolate dawn of the 20th century, Colombia was a nation adrift, a ghost haunting the ruins of its own making. The 1,000 Days War had bled it white, and the humiliating amputation of Panama was a phantom limb that ached with the memory of failure. The old certainties of the 19th century, the epic struggles between liberals and conservatives, the debates over the role of the church, the very map of the Republic, had led only to bankruptcy, bloodshed, and dismemberment. Out of this profound national crisis, a collective yearning for a new path began to emerge, a desperate search for a project that could bind the nation's wounds and build a future that was not predicated on political fanaticism. This project would not be found in the halls of Congress or in the barracks of generals, but on the steep, rain-swept slopes of the Andean Cordilleras. It was the age of coffee, a small red bean that would, against all odds, succeed where politics had failed, caffeinating a stagnant economy and brewing a new, modern national identity. Coffee had existed in Colombia since the 18th century, a curiosity often planted by priests who encouraged its cultivation as an act of penance, but had remained a minor crop, overshadowed by tobacco, indigo, and quinine. Its destiny began to change in the latter half of the 19th century, driven not by a grand government plan, but by the quiet, relentless ambition of thousands of ordinary families. This was particularly true in the rugged, mountainous department of Antioquia. The Antioquinos, a people known for their fierce independence, piety, and shrewd business acumen, began a massive process of internal colonization, a slow-moving human wave that pushed south and west into the temperate, forest-clad middle slopes of the central and western Cordilleras. This was not a conquest, but a painstaking act of creation. Family by family, armed with axes and machetes, they cleared small plots of jungle on incredibly steep terrain, planting their subsistence crops. Alongside the precious coffee seedlings, this process created a unique land tenure system, a landscape dominated not by vast, feudal haciendas like those in Brazil or Central America, but by thousands of small, family-owned farms or fincas. This Antioquino colonization was the bedrock of the coffee revolution. It fostered a culture of hard work, self-reliance, and family enterprise that became the engine of the new economy. The entire family unit was involved in the meticulous process of coffee cultivation, planting the bushes in the shade of larger trees, hand-picking only the perfectly ripe red cherries, processing them in small, hand-cranked mills, despolpadoras, washing and fermenting the beans, and then spreading them out on large patios or sliding trays elbows to be dried by the sun. This intensive, hands-on process produced a mild, high-quality bean that began to fetch premium prices on the world market. The wealth generated by coffee did not remain concentrated in the hands of a few aristocrats. It flowed down to a broad new class of small and medium-sized landowners, creating a rural middle class that had never before existed. This shared prosperity began to subtly reshape the nation's social DNA. offering a path to upward mobility that was based on labor and land, not inherited privilege or political connection. The challenge, however, was immense. How to get the coffee from these remote, isolated fincas in the heart of the Andes to the ports on the Caribbean coast for export to New York and Hamburg? The answer was the mule. For decades, the arriero, the rugged mule driver, was the indispensable hero of the coffee economy, leading long trains of mules laden with 60-kilogram sacks of coffee. These men navigated treacherous mountain paths, forded raging rivers, and traversed dizzying precipices. Their work was the vital link in a fragile chain, connecting the isolated producer to the global market. But as the coffee boom accelerated in the 1910s and 1920s, mule trains were no longer enough. The wealth generated by coffee exports finally gave the state the capital it needed to embark on a great wave of modernization. A frenzy of infrastructure projects began, financed by coffee money. Railways snaked their way up river valleys. Immense steel cableways were constructed to carry coffee sacks over impassable mountain ranges, and roads were slowly blasted through the rock. This infrastructure, built to serve the coffee industry, had the profound secondary effect of physically integrating a country that had been defined by its geographic fragmentation, stitching the Andean interior to the coasts and to the world. As coffee became the undisputed king of the Colombian economy, it also became the core of a new national narrative. In 1927, the growers, with government backing, came together to form the Federación Nacional de Cafeteros de Colombia, FNC. The FNC was a brilliant and unique institution, a non-profit entity charged with defending the interests of the 500,000 coffee growers. It guaranteed a stable purchase price, insulated farmers from a volatility of the international market, provided technical support, built schools and health clinics in rural areas, and most crucially, it began to market Colombian coffee as a premium global brand. The FNC consciously crafted and promoted the image of the stoic, hard-working cafetero, with his wide-brimmed hat, his poncho, and his faithful mule. This figure, later personified by the fictional character Juan Valdez, became a powerful and unifying national symbol. He represented not the divisive politics of the past, but the wholesome, productive values of the land. He was neither liberal nor conservative. He was simply Colombian. In a country scarred by factionalism, the shared identity of being a coffee nation was a potent, cohesive force. The coffee boom of the early 20th century was not a magical solution to all of Colombia's problems. It created a dangerous economic monoculture, leaving the nation's fortunes perilously tied to the fluctuating price of a single commodity, a vulnerability that would become painfully apparent with the Wall Street crash of 1929. It did not erase the deep-seated political hatreds, which continued to simmer beneath the surface of the new prosperity, but its impact was undeniably transformative. It financed the creation of a modern state, built the roads and railways that connected its disparate regions, and fostered the growth of a new industrial and financial class in cities like Medellin and Bogota. It gave the nation a positive identity, a source of pride, and a common economic purpose after a century of self-destruction. The humble coffee bean had re-engineered the nation's economy and its self-image, building a fragile bridge of modernity that carried Colombia out of the 19th century and into the turbulent dawn of a new era. Part 10. The Violencia, a scar on the national soul. The fragile peace brewed by coffee prosperity began to sour in the 1940s. The new modernity had brought roads, wealth, and a unifying national symbol, but it had not healed the century-old wound of political sectarianism. The tribal identities of liberal and conservative, muted but not erased by the shared project of economic growth, lay dormant beneath the soil, waiting for the right conditions to erupt once more. The catalyst for this eruption was not a single event, but a confluence of pressures: rising social inequality in the cities, bitter land disputes in the countryside, and the emergence of a charismatic political firebrand who threatened to upend the entire established order. This confluence would plunge Colombia into a decade-long paroxysm of savagery, known simply as La Violencia, a period of undeclared civil war so brutal and chaotic that it would leave a permanent scar on the national soul, reshaping the country's DNA with a chromosome of endemic violence that would prove tragically resilient. The figure at the center of the storm was Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, a mestizo born outside the traditional white elite. Gaitan was a brilliant lawyer and spellbinding orator, a populist who channeled the immense frustrations of the urban poor and landless peasants. As a liberal, he railed against what he called the political country of the oligarchy, both liberal and conservative, and spoke for the national country of the common people. His speeches were electrifying, his denunciations of Social injustice resonated with millions who felt left behind by the coffee boom. He promised a moral restoration of the republic and became the undisputed leader of the popular wing of a liberal party, poised to win the 1950 presidential election. For the entrenched elites of both parties, he was a terrifying threat, a demagogue who risked inciting a class war that would consume them all. For his followers, he was a secular messiah, the only man who could truly speak for them. On the afternoon of April 9, 1948, as he was leaving his office in downtown Bogota, Jorge Eliezer Gaitan was shot and killed by a lone gunman. The reaction was instantaneous and volcanic. When the news of his assassination spread by radio, the city of Bogota exploded in a convulsion of grief and rage. Mobs poured into the streets, lynching the presumed assassin and storming the symbols of power, government buildings, churches, and the mansions of the wealthy. The city center was set ablaze, its tram cars overturned, its shops looted. This was the Bogotazo, a riot that lasted for 3 days and reduced the heart of the nation's capital to a smoldering ruin. The uprising was not a coordinated revolution, but a spontaneous, leaderless howl of fury. With their hope for peaceful change murdered in broad daylight, the people lashed out at everything that represented the political country they felt had killed him, the government, led by conservative President Mariano. Ospina Perez was paralyzed, barely able to secure the presidential palace as the city burned around it. The fires of the Bogotazo were eventually extinguished, but the flames leaped from the city into the countryside, igniting the full-blown nightmare of La Violencia. In the Andean highlands, in the coffee-growing regions, in the vast eastern plains, the murder of Gaitan was the signal to settle old scores. This was not a war of formal armies fighting over territory, as in the Thousand Days' War. It was a dirty, intimate, and sadistically cruel conflict in towns where political affiliation was known to everyone. Conservative police forces and armed civilian militias, pajaros or birds, began to systematically persecute, dispossess, and murder liberal families. In response, liberals formed their own self-defense groups and guerrilla bands, which retaliated with equal ferocity. Neighbors turned on neighbors, villages became armed camps, and violence became the primary form of political expression. The conflict developed its own macabre rituals, including horrific forms of mutilation and killing designed to terrorize the opposition, a practice that came to be known as the corte de corbata, the necktie cut. This was a multifaceted war, not a simple two-sided conflict. While its origins were political, it quickly took on social and economic dimensions. Local landowners used the chaos to expand their holdings, hiring pajaros to drive liberal peasants off their valuable coffee farms. Bandits, loyal to no one but themselves, roamed the countryside, extorting and killing under the guise of political affiliation. The state effectively collapsed in many rural areas, replaced by the law of the gun. Over the next decade, an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 Colombians were killed, and more than 2 million people, nearly a fifth of the country's population at the time, were forcibly displaced, fleeing the butchery in the countryside for the relative safety of the cities. This mass internal migration dramatically and permanently altered the nation's demographics, accelerating urbanization and creating vast shantytowns, barrios de invasion, on the peripheries of Bogota, Medellin, and Cali. La Violencia hollowed out the Colombian countryside, replacing farming communities with ghosts and fear. By the mid-1950s, the nation was bleeding to death. The traditional parties had unleashed a monster they could no longer control. In desperate attempt to end the slaughter, the political elites, the same political country Gaitan had denounced, turned to the military. In 1953, General Gustavo Rojas Pinilla seized power in a coup d'etat, promising to restore order. Initially popular for offering an amnesty that saw the demobilization of many liberal guerrillas, Rojas Pinilla's rule grew. Increasingly dictatorial, and he was eventually ousted in 1957. Faced with the prospect of either continued military rule or return to the sectarian slaughter, the leaders of the liberal and conservative parties, in an extraordinary act of self-preservation, brokered a deal. Meeting in Spain, they agreed to set aside their differences and share power for the next 16 years. This was the National Front, an agreement where the two parties would alternate the presidency and divide all government posts equally. The National Front succeeded in its primary objective. It ended the inter-party bloodshed of La Violencia. The killing between liberals and conservatives largely stopped. But the peace it created was an artificial and exclusionary one. By creating a formal power-sharing cartel, it closed off all avenues for political dissent. New political movements had no way to participate in the system. Some of the liberal guerrilla groups who had demobilized under Rojas Pinilla feeling betrayed. by their party's deal with the conservatives and inspired by the Cuban Revolution, refused to accept the new order. They saw the National Front not as a peace treaty, but as a pact between oligarchs. Believing that the path to real change was still closed, they retreated back into the mountains, keeping their weapons and their revolutionary ideologies. They would become the seeds of new, more ideologically driven guerrilla movements, the FARC and the ELN. La Violencia was over, but the scar it left on the nation's soul would continue to fester, giving birth to new and even more complex forms of violence that would plague Colombia for the rest of the 20th century. Part 11. The Emerald Empire, Green Fire, and its Price. Deep within the jagged folds of the Eastern Cordillera, in a remote, humid region of the department of Boyacá, lies a treasure that has bewitched humanity for centuries. It is not gold, but something rarer, and for many, more beautiful. The Colombian emerald. These are not just any emeralds, they are the finest in the world, stones of a unique, deep, verdant fire, born of a freak geological event that filled calcite veins with the perfect combination of chromium, vanadium, and beryllium. The Muisca had revered them, offering them to the gods alongside their golden tunjos. The Spanish conquistadors had plundered them, sending chests of green fire back to the courts of Europe and the treasuries of Mughal emperors. But in the latter half of the 20th century, as the embers of La Violencia still glowed, this geological anomaly became the epicenter of a new and vicious conflict. A private war fought for control of the Earth's green heart, creating a lawless empire of immense wealth and staggering brutality. The primary battlegrounds were the rugged hills surrounding the towns of Muzo and Chiver, places whose names had been synonymous with emeralds since pre-Columbian times. For centuries, the mines were state-controlled, but the government's presence was weak and riddled with corruption. The real power belonged to the Esmeralderos, the tough, independent miners who worked the land. Following the chaos of La Violencia, the state effectively abandoned its claim, and the mines fell into the hands of powerful local families and warlords. A new, violent order emerged, based not on law, but on loyalty, firepower, and the unwritten code of the Emerald Zone. This was a world unto itself, a feudal kingdom with its own armies, its own justice, and its own kings. Life was cheap, but a single high-quality stone, a canutillo of perfect color, could make a man rich overnight. This potent combination of poverty and potential wealth created a frantic, dangerous energy, a green fever, that drew thousands of fortune seekers, known as guaqueros, to the region. The guaqueros were the lowest rung of this emerald empire. They were itinerant miners who worked under the most perilous conditions, sifting through the tons of shale and rock discarded by the major mining operations, hoping to find an overlooked gem. They would spend days, weeks, even months combing through the tailings, living in makeshift camps, their faces caked with mud, their hopes pinned on a glint of green. It was a life of extreme hardship and constant risk, not just from the landslides that could bury them in an instant, but from a network of enforcers and gunmen who controlled the territory. Finding a stone was only the first challenge. The second was getting it out of the mining zone and to the markets in Bogota without being robbed or killed. This raw, desperate struggle for survival and sudden wealth was the engine of the entire industry, providing the labor and the constant supply of stones that fueled the fortunes of those at the top. At the apex of this violent pyramid stood the patrones, the Emerald Barons. These were men of immense power and charisma who had fought their way to the top through cunning and force. The most legendary of them all was Victor Carranza, the Emerald Czar. A man of humble origins who started as a guaquero himself, Carranza, through a decades-long campaign of strategic alliances and brutal warfare, consolidated control over the most productive mines in the Muzo region. He commanded a private army of hundreds of men, dispensing his own brand of justice and becoming the ultimate arbiter of disputes in the Emerald Zone. He was a paradoxical figure, a ruthless warlord accused of financing paramilitary death squads, yet also a paternalistic figure who provided jobs and a semblance of order in a region the state had forgotten. The story of the emerald trade in the late 20th century is inseparable from the story of Carranza and his rivals, men who fought bloody wars for control of mining tunnels and smuggling routes. These conflicts, known as the Green Wars, were periods of intense, internecine fighting that turned the hills of Boyacá into a battlefield. The first Green War erupted in the 1960s, a chaotic free-for-all among rival families and gangs. The second and more brutal war broke out in the late 1980s. This time the conflict was more organized and far deadlier, as the Emerald Barons formed alliances with another rising power in the Colombian underworld, the Medellin drug cartel led by Pablo Escobar, Escobar sought to launder his cocaine profits and gain a foothold in the lucrative and untraceable emerald business. He allied with one faction of Esmeralderos against Carranza and his allies. The result was a horrific war that involved car bombs, massacres, and targeted assassinations, with the violence spilling out of the remote mining region and into the streets of Bogota. It was a war fought with automatic weapons and dynamite, a struggle for the fusion of two of Colombia's most profitable and violent illegal economies. By the early 1990s, the Green War had reached a bloody stalemate, devastating the region and threatening the entire industry. In a remarkable turn of events, the warring patrones, with the Catholic Church acting as a mediator, sat down and negotiated a peace treaty. They agreed to end the fighting, divide the territory, and establish a new code of conduct. This pact, though fragile, largely held, bringing a measure of stability to the Emerald Zone, the era of the all-powerful. Untouchable czars began to wane as the government, pushed by international pressure for a more transparent and clean gemstone market, slowly started to reassert its presence. Large, foreign mining corporations began to move in, bringing industrial-scale technology and formal labor practices that challenged the old, feudal system. The price of the green fire that had fueled this empire was a legacy of violence, environmental degradation, and a deep-seated culture of lawlessness that would not be easily erased. The emeralds, once sacred offerings to the gods, had become symbols of a different kind of power, one born from the earth, paid for in blood, and as brilliant and flawed as the nation that produced them. Part 12. A River of Voices, the Literary Boom. While the Colombian countryside was consumed by the intertwined wars of politics, drugs, and green fire, a different kind of explosion was taking place, one of imagination and language. In the quiet studies of Bogota, on the breezy balconies of Cartagena, and in the smoky cafes of cities around the world, a generation of Colombian writers was transmuting the nation's violent, surreal, and beautiful reality into literary gold. This was not merely a golden age of the novel, it was a profound act of national interpretation, a way for the country to understand its own fractured soul. The Colombian literary boom of the mid-20th century was a river of voices that drew its tributaries from the country's deepest sources, from the whispers of grandmothers, the bombast of politicians, the forgotten histories of civil wars, and the overwhelming, hallucinatory presence of the landscape itself. They created a new language to describe a world that defied conventional realism, a world where the line between myth and history, miracle and massacre, was porous and indistinct. The source of this great river, the figure who would become a literary patriarch for all of Latin America, was Gabriel Garcia Marquez. Raised by his grandparents in the sweltering, dusty town of Aracataca, near the Caribbean coast, Garcia Marquez absorbed the oral traditions of a culture steeped in superstition, folklore, and the outlandish tales of relatives. His grandmother's deadpan delivery of the most fantastic stories, combined with his grandfather's gritty tales of fighting in the Thousand Days' War, became the raw material for his art. After years working as a journalist, a craft that honed his eye for detail and his ear for the way people spoke, he retreated to a room in Mexico City to write the novel that had been brewing inside him for 2 decades. The result, published in 1967, was 100 Years of Solitude, a book that would not only redefine Colombian literature, but would also become a universal touchstone of 20th century fiction. 100 Years of Solitude was more than a novel. It was a national epic compressed into the saga of a single family, the Buendias, in the mythical town of Macondo. Macondo was Aracataca, but it was also all of Colombia. Its history, from its innocent founding to the arrival of the railway, the violence of a banana plantation massacre, and the endless, cyclical civil wars between liberals and conservatives who can no longer remember why they are fighting, was a poetic mirror of Colombia's own troubled past. What made the novel revolutionary was its style, magical realism. In Macondo, priests levitate after drinking hot chocolate, a young woman ascends to heaven while folding laundry, and a plague of insomnia sweeps through the town, forcing people to label every object so they don't forget its name. For Garcia Marquez, this was not fantasy, it was an artistic tool, a way of representing a reality where the unbelievable was a daily occurrence. The novel captured the Colombian experience of living in a country where history felt like a myth, where solitude was the national condition, and where the past was a constant, haunting presence. It gave Colombia a new way to see itself, not as a failure, but as a place of mythic, tragic grandeur. While Garcia Marquez became the global icon, he was not a solitary peak, but the highest summit in a range of formidable literary talents. His contemporary and close friend, Alvaro Mutis, explored a different facet of the Colombian soul. Mutis, a poet and novelist, created the unforgettable character of Macrol de Gaviero, the Krausness Watcher, a wandering, world-weary sailor who is forever embarking on doomed enterprises in lush, decaying tropical landscapes. Macrol's adventures, set in the hot lands, Tierra Caliente, of river ports and jungles, are infused with a deep, philosophical pessimism and a profound sense of decay. His world is one of rust, rot, and disillusionment, a counterpoint to Macondo's magic. If Garcia Marquez wrote about the solitude of history, Mutis wrote about the solitude of the individual, adrift in a world where every venture is destined to fail, yet driven to keep trying by a stubborn, almost noble sense of futility. His work captured the grit and the grime of the country's vast riverine interior, a world far from the Andean highlands, a place of immense beauty and profound melancholy. A darker, more urban, and more explicitly political current also flowed through this literary river. Writers who came of age during and after La Violencia tackled the raw wounds of recent history with a stark, often brutal, realism. Gustavo Alvarez Gardizabal's novel Condors no entierran todos los días, Condors don't bury every day, provided a terrifying, thinly fictionalized account of a conservative pajaro, a political assassin in a small town during La Violencia, exposing the intimate, neighbor against neighbor horror of the conflict. Later, in the 1980s and 90s, as the violence of the drug cartels consumed the cities, a new generation of writers emerged. Fernando Vallejo, with his furious, nihilistic, and autobiographical novels like Our Lady of the Assassins, depicted a Medellin overrun by teenage hitmen, sicarios, where life had become utterly worthless. His prose was a Molotov cocktail thrown at a corrupt society, a scream of rage against the degradation of his beloved city. These writers refused the comfort of myth, forcing their readers to confront the ugliness of the present, the moral vacuum created by decades of unresolved conflict. This river of voices, in all its diversity, performed an essential function for a country struggling with its identity. It provided a collective memory in a place suffering from a historical amnesia where official narratives often sought to pave over the traumas of the past. The novelists became the nation's true historians, its conscience, and its dreamers. They showed how the ghost of the Thousand Days War still haunted the protagonists of La Violencia, and how the solitude of the displaced peasant was reborn in the alienated sicario of the urban slum. They gave names to the ghosts and mapped the labyrinth of the nation's psyche. Through the magic of Macondo, the melancholy of Macrol, and the fury of Vallejo, Colombian literature created a space where the country could be seen in its full, bewildering complexity. Its immense capacity for cruelty, and its equally immense capacity for endurance, its tragic history, and its stubborn, miraculous, and life-affirming imagination. Part 13. The Urban Labyrinth, Cities in Flux. The second half of the 20th century witnessed one of the most profound transformations in Colombia's human geography. The great emptying of the countryside and the explosive growth of the cities. This was not a gentle migration driven by opportunity, but a frantic exodus propelled by fear. La Violencia had torn the social fabric of rural life, turning millions of peasants into refugees in their own country. They fled the machete and the musket, abandoning their small plots of land, and poured into the cities, seeking the anonymity and relative safety of the urban crowd. This mass displacement, compounded by decades of subsequent guerrilla conflict and paramilitary terror, fundamentally rewired the nation's DNA. Colombia, which for centuries had been a predominantly rural, agrarian society, was hurtled into a chaotic and accelerated urbanization, creating sprawling, labyrinthine cities that became both crucibles of unimaginable violence and engines of incredible resilience and creativity. The cities were utterly unprepared for this human deluge. Bogota, Medellin, and Cali, which had been relatively compact, manageable cities in the 1940s, saw their populations double and then double again. The newcomers arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the trauma they carried inside. With no housing available, they did the only thing they could. They built their own, on the steep, unstable hillsides that ringed the formal cities, and in the floodplains of lowland. Rivers, vast new settlements appeared almost overnight. These were the barrios de invasion or comunas, shantytowns built from scavenged materials, tin, cardboard, plastic sheeting, and cinder blocks. They lacked the most basic services. There was no running water, no sanitation, no electricity, no paved roads, and no police presence. They were cities of mud and hope. testament to the human instinct to create order out of chaos, but they were also deeply vulnerable, existing outside the law and beyond the reach of the state. Into this vacuum of state authority, new forms of power emerged. During the 1980s, these burgeoning informal cities became the recruiting grounds and operational centers for the burgeoning drug cartels. For a generation of young men who had grown up in poverty, with no legal opportunities and no hope for the future, the cartels offered an intoxicating alternative. They offered money, power, respect, and a sense of belonging. In Medellin, Pablo Escobar's cartel cultivated a powerful social base in the comunas, playing a role the state had abdicated. He built football pitches, handed out cash, and positioned himself as a Robin Hood figure, even as he turned the city's youth into his private army of sicarios. The cities became the primary battlegrounds of the drug wars. Car bombs detonated in shopping centers, judges and journalists were assassinated in broad daylight, and the police fought pitched battles with heavily armed teenagers in the winding alleyways of the comunas. The homicide rate in cities like Medellin and Cali skyrocketed to become the highest in the world, making them symbols of a society on the brink of collapse. Yet even in the darkest days, the urban labyrinth was more than just a landscape of violence. It was also a space of extraordinary social innovation and cultural dynamism. Faced with government neglect, the residents of the comunas developed powerful networks of solidarity and self-organization. Neighbors formed community councils, juntas de acción comunal, to pool their resources and labor, building their own water systems, stringing up their own power lines, and petitioning the government for schools and health clinics. These grassroots organizations became the de facto governance in many areas, a testament to a resilient civic spirit that refused to be extinguished by violence or neglect. This spirit of self-building was not just physical, but also cultural. The cities became vibrant melting pots where regional cultures, forcibly thrown together, fused into new forms. The music of the Caribbean coast mingled with the Andean bambuco, and the rhythms of the Pacific found a new home in the salsa clubs of Cali, which became the undisputed salsa capital of the world. Beginning in the late 1990s and accelerating into the 21st century, a remarkable transformation began to take place, most famously in Medellin. A new generation of urban planners and forward-thinking mayors like Sergio Fajardo realized that the traditional, top-down approaches to urban problems had failed. They understood that the key to healing the city was to bridge the gap between the formal, wealthy city of walls and the informal, impoverished city of hills. Their philosophy was social urbanism, the idea that strategic investments in public infrastructure and architecture in the poorest neighborhoods could be a powerful tool for social change. Instead of just sending in more police, they built state-of-the-art library parks, cultural centers, and schools in the heart of the most violent comunas. These were not just buildings, they were statements of intent. Beautiful and dignified spaces that told the residents of these forgotten neighborhoods that they were part of the city, that their lives mattered. The most iconic symbols of this urban transformation were the public transportation projects. In Bogota, the city implemented the Transmilenio, a bus rapid transit system that provided fast, efficient transport for millions, including the residents of the vast southern periphery. In Medellin, the city did something even more radical. It built a series of gondola lifts, known as the Metro Cable, that soared up the steep hillsides, connecting the highest, poorest comunas directly to the cities. Metro system below. This was a revolution in mobility and mentality. A journey that once took over an hour of navigating a confusing and dangerous network of buses could now be made in 10 minutes. The Metro Cable physically and symbolically stitched the informal city into the formal one, breaking down the barriers of geography and class. It allowed residents from the hills to access jobs and education in the city center, and it allowed people from the center to visit the once feared comunas, fostering a new sense of a shared urban identity. The urban labyrinth, once a symbol of Colombia's chaos and violence, was slowly being reimagined as a laboratory for social innovation, a place where a wounded society was learning to heal itself, one cable car, one library, one community at a time. Part 14. Echoes of the Ancestors. Indigenous Resilience. In the grand narrative of Colombia's formation, a story dominated by gold, civil wars, and cocaine, the nation's original inhabitants have often been relegated to the footnotes of history, treated as a vanquished people who either disappeared or were assimilated into the mestizo mainstream. Yet, to consign them to the past is to miss one of the most remarkable stories of survival and resilience in the Americas. While their numbers were decimated and their worlds were shattered by the conquest, indigenous peoples did not vanish. They retreated into the continent's most inaccessible regions, the highest peaks, the densest jungles, the most remote deserts, where they became the guardians of a deep, ancestral memory. In the late 20th and early 21st centuries, these forgotten communities emerged from the shadows, not as relics of a bygone era, but as potent political and spiritual actors, reminding a nation struggling with its identity that its oldest DNA, the very first thread in its complex weave, was still alive. For centuries, the primary strategy for survival was withdrawal and resistance. In the searing heat of the Guajira Peninsula, the Wayu people, with their fierce pastoralist traditions and complex clan system, adeptly adopted the horse and firearm, successfully resisting Spanish and later Colombian domination for centuries. They maintained their own system of justice and social organization. Living in a world that straddled the national border with Venezuela, their loyalty ultimately to their matriarchal lineage, not a distant government in Bogota. In Sierra Nevada de Santa Marta, the descendants of the Tairona, the Kogi, Arhuaco, Waiwa, and Canquamo peoples retreated higher and higher into the mountain sanctuary they call the heart of the world. Here, they preserve their cosmological worldview, a profound spiritual ecology in which every element of the mountain is sacred and interconnected. Their leaders, the Mamos, continued to perform the rituals and make the offerings necessary to maintain the balance of the universe, a task they believe is essential for the health of the entire planet. The turning point that brought these communities from the periphery to the center of a national conversation was the Colombian Constitution of 1991. This landmark document, born from a peace process and a desire to create a more inclusive and pluralistic society, was revolutionary. For the first time, it officially recognized Colombia as a multi-ethnic and multicultural nation. It moved beyond the fiction of a homogeneous mestizo republic and acknowledged the rights of indigenous peoples to their distinct identities, languages, and cultures. Crucially, it enshrined their right to collective ownership of their ancestral lands, creating legal entities known as resguardos, or indigenous reserves. This constitutional recognition provided a powerful legal weapon for communities to reclaim their territories and assert a degree of political autonomy. Over the next 2 decades, vast swathes of the country, particularly in the Amazon basin and the Andean highlands, were formally titled as resguardos, giving indigenous authorities legal jurisdiction over territories larger than many European countries. This new legal framework empowered a generation of indigenous leaders who mastered the language of law and human rights to fight their battles not with arrows, but with legal briefs and political organizing. They formed powerful national organizations like the National Indigenous Organization of Colombia, ONIC, to advocate for their collective interests in Bogota and on the international stage. They learned to navigate the complex corridors of power, demanding that the state fulfill its constitutional obligations. This activism often came at a terrible cost, because their territories were frequently located in strategic, resource-rich, and conflict-ridden areas. Indigenous leaders who stood up to illegal miners, loggers, coca growers, and armed groups, both guerrillas and paramilitaries, were systematically targeted, threatened, and assassinated. They were caught in the crossfire of a war they did not start, their commitment to neutrality and the defense of their land seen as a threat by all sides. The struggle for rights became a struggle for life itself. In recent years, the voice of indigenous Colombia has grown more confident and more visible, challenging the nation to confront uncomfortable truths about its past and its future. The peoples of the Sierra Nevada, led by their Mamos, have stepped forward as humanity's elder brothers, warning that the environmental destruction of the lowlands, the deforestation, the river pollution, the mining, is damaging the heart of the world and pushing the entire planet towards ecological collapse. Their message, once dismissed as mystical folklore, now resonates with a global audience grappling with climate change, lending an ancient, spiritual authority to the modern environmental movement. In the southwestern department of Cauca, the NASA people have become renowned for their indigenous guard, Guardia Indigena, an unarmed civilian defense force that has courageously stood up to armed actors, peacefully escorting them from their territories, armed only with their traditional staffs of office, bastones amando, symbols of moral and community authority. They represent a powerful alternative to the endless cycle of violence, a commitment to defending life without resorting to the weapons of war. The resurgence of indigenous identity is a profound rebalancing of the Colombian narrative. It challenges the colonial idea that history began in 1492 and asserts a much deeper timeline. It offers a different model of development, one based not on endless extraction but on the sacred duty to care for the earth, a concept they call bien vivir, or good living. It reintroduces a spiritual dimension into a national conversation often dominated by politics and economics. The echoes of the ancestors, once faint and distant, are now being heard in the nation's highest courts, in its universities, and in its social movements. They remind all Colombians that the DNA of a nation is not just a product of Spanish cathedrals and liberal conservative wars, but is also rooted in the sacred geography of its mountains, the wisdom of its shamans, and the enduring resilience of its first peoples, who, after 500 years of resistance, are still teaching their country what it means to truly belong to the land. Part 15. A Symphony of Flavors, the Culinary Tapestry. If the soul of a nation can be found anywhere, it is in its kitchen. There, in the humble alchemy of a hearth, the grand, abstract narratives of history, conquest, migration, and resilience are rendered into something tangible, something that can be tasted and shared. The DNA of Colombia is not just encoded in its bloodlines and its landscapes, but is simmered into its soups, ground into its cornmeal, and infused into its sauces. Colombian cuisine is not a single, monolithic entity, but a delicious and complex symphony, a culinary tapestry woven from three great continental threads: the ancient, earthy foundation of indigenous Americas, the savory and substantial imposition of Spain, and the deep, rhythmic soul of Africa. To eat in Colombia is to commune with its past, to partake in a daily act of historical memory that unites a nation often divided by its own story. The bedrock of this culinary world is pre-Hispanic, built upon the crops that nourished the first peoples and the great Andean chiefdoms. Maize, in its infinite varieties, is the foundational grain, the stuff of life itself. It is most purely expressed in the arepa, a simple patty of ground corn cooked on a griddle, a food of stunning versatility that is the daily bread of all social classes. From the Andean highlands to the Caribbean coast, its form changes from region to region, thick or thin, large or small, plain or filled with cheese, but its presence is a constant, a direct link to the Muisca and the Tirona. Alongside maize stand the thousands of varieties of potato, the treasure of the high Andes, which form the starchy heart of highland soups. And in the hot, humid lowlands, the starchy role is played by yucca, cassava, a root vegetable of profound importance. This indigenous pantry, rich with beans, squash, avocados, and an astonishing array of fruits like lulo, passion fruit, and guava, forms the deep, resonant bass note of the entire culinary symphony. Upon this indigenous foundation, the Spanish conquest layered a new world of flavors and ingredients, a forceful imposition that fundamentally altered the Colombian plate. The conquistadors brought with them their livestock, introducing beef, pork, and chicken into a continent that had few large domesticated animals. This transformed the concept of a meal, adding a new, savory centerpiece. The sizzle of pork fat rendering into chicharron, the slow simmering of a beef shank for a stew. These were new sounds and smells in the Andean air. The Spanish also introduced wheat, rice, onions, garlic, cilantro, and citrus fruits, ingredients that would weave themselves so thoroughly into the local cuisine as to seem native. The Spanish love for slow-cooked stews, cocidos, merged with the indigenous tradition of soups, giving rise to some of Colombia's most iconic dishes. These pucheros and sancochos became edible metaphors for mestizage, the mixing of peoples and cultures, where Spanish meats and European vegetables bobbed happily alongside native potatoes, corn, and yucca in a single, harmonious pot. The third great movement in this symphony arrived in chains, carried in the memory of the enslaved Africans brought to work the mines and coastal plantations. From the ports of Cartagena and the Pacific coast, a new culinary aesthetic radiated, one characterized by bold flavors, unique techniques, and a deep connection to a lost homeland. The most significant African contribution was the coconut, which, when grated and pressed, yielded a rich, fragrant milk that became the signature flavor of coastal cuisine. Fish, freshly caught from the sea, bathed in a sauce of coconut milk, herbs, and spices, is the taste of the Colombian Caribbean. Africans also brought with them the plantain, a starchy fruit that would become a national obsession, whether fried into sweet, caramelized maduros or pounded and double-fried into the savory, crispy discs known as patacons. They introduced yams, new cooking techniques, and a profound understanding of how to build complex, soulful flavors, adding a vibrant, rhythmic pulse to the culinary tapestry. This intermingling of ingredients and traditions did not create a uniform national cuisine, but rather a constellation of distinct regional kitchens, each a unique expression of its local geography and history. In the cool heights of Bogota, the quintessential dish is ajiaco, a rich chicken soup combining three different kinds of native potatoes, corn on the cob, and an herb called guasca. Garnished at the table with European cream and capers, a perfect bowl of highland mestizage. In the mountainous coffee-growing region of Antioquia, the star is the bandeja paisa, a platter of colossal proportions that speaks of the hard labor of peasant life. Red beans, white rice, ground beef, chicharron, a fried egg, chorizo sausage, sweet plantains, an arepa, and a slice of avocado. It is a dish that is not so much eaten as it is conquered. On the Caribbean coast, the table is laden with coconut rice, fried fish, and hearty stews like the sancocho trifásico, a robust soup made with beef, chicken, and pork all in one pot. And on the remote Pacific coast, a region of immense biodiversity, the cuisine is a revelation of fresh seafood and exotic fruits, seasoned with local herbs grown in rooftop gardens, hierbas de rosati, a testament to the region's deep African roots. This symphony of flavors is more than just sustenance, it is a form of communion. In a country whose history is so often defined by conflict and division, the shared table is one of the few truly national spaces. It is where families gather, where communities celebrate, and where the deep, complex, and often painful story of the nation is told and retold, not in words, but in the familiar, comforting language of food. The Colombian plate is a history lesson, a map, and a prophecy. Speaks of the ancient earth, the violent collision of continents, and the resilient creation of a new world. It is the most intimate and enduring expression of the nation's DNA, a living testament to the fact that out of many disparate and conflicting ingredients, it is possible to create a single, rich, and nourishing whole.
Thank you for joining us on this journey through Colombia's past. From ancient goldsmiths to modern innovators, this story is one of profound resilience. Subscribe for more deep dives into history. And remember that every nation's story is a tapestry woven from countless threads of conflict, culture, and hope.